To get a handle on a figure like Joseph Stalin, you can't just condemn him. You have to dissect him. Now, this isn't about making excuses. Think of it as a psychological autopsy. We're going to go inside his mind to try and understand the machinery of his power, the very architecture of his paranoia, and the twisted internal logic that led to the deaths of millions of people.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. We're going to build his world from the inside out. First, we'll explore the brutal childhood that forged his mind. Then, we'll step into the brutal world he created for millions of others. And only after we've really been inside these realities, these caves as we'll call them, will we bring in the big analytical tools, everything from ancient philosophy to modern game theory, to truly understand the mechanics of his terror.
All right, part 1. To understand the man, you've got to understand the world that made him. And I'm not talking about grand politics yet. I'm talking about the small, violent, claustrophobic world of his childhood, where the blueprint for his entire life was drafted.
This is where it all starts. Not in the Kremlin, but in a tiny, dirt-floored home in Gori, Georgia. This quote from someone who knew him as a kid, "It's not just a sad memory, it's a diagnosis. It's the origin story for a personality forged in violence, where the only lesson he ever learned was simple and absolute. The world is a brutal place, and you are either the hammer or the anvil."
You know, every detail here is a piece of the psychological puzzle. You have his father, a failed cobbler, just pouring all of his own rage and humiliation onto his son. You have his mother, who sees the priesthood as the only way out from that violence. And on top of it all, he's physically marked, scarred by smallpox, a crippled arm. So what does a young man like that call himself? He picks Koba, a character from a book, a heroic Georgian outlaw, an avenger who lives by his own rules. It's a power fantasy, plain and simple, created to escape a reality where he had no power at all. These experiences became the core code of his mind. Trust no one, weakness is fatal, control must be total.
And the world outside his home? Well, it just confirmed everything he'd already learned. He goes to seminary, but it's not a place of spiritual learning. It's a prison. You've got monks spying on students, reading their mail, listening in on conversations. Sound familiar? It was basically the perfect training ground for a future dictator. So when he gets kicked out and joins the revolutionary underground, he's just swapping one world of paranoia for another. Now his survival literally depends on secret codes, fake names, and the constant fear of a traitor in his midst. The world wasn't a community, it was a war zone of hidden enemies.
And then came the Russian Civil War, an absolutely brutal, chaotic period where friends became enemies overnight. For Stalin, this wasn't just some political event. It was the ultimate proof that his deepest, darkest beliefs about the world were correct. All those lessons from his childhood became his principles of government. His psychological cave was now complete. The door was sealed shut.
Okay, so we've just built Stalin's cave from the inside. We've seen what made him. Now we have to step inside the caves he built for millions of other people, because the worldview of the man at the very top becomes the reality for everyone down at the bottom.
Just let that quote sink in for a second. It's from a woman in the Gulag. After months of getting no mail, she finally gets 3 letters from her family. And her first feeling isn't joy, it's disappointment that it wasn't a piece of bread. That's the horror of the world Stalin created. A world where the most basic human connections are just erased by the animal need to survive. This is more than just suffering. It is a complete inversion of morality.
This slide shows you the giant chasm between the official story and the real story. And it wasn't just a lie. It was a totally separate reality. You had propaganda posters showing these happy kids, while in reality, the children of arrested enemies were treated like social lepers. The state promised a paradise for workers, but any worker who couldn't meet an impossible quota was branded a saboteur and disappeared. They claimed they were modernizing farms for the peasants, but the word kulak, which supposedly meant a rich peasant, became a weapon. It was so vague it could mean anyone you didn't like. And in that gap, between the official word and the lived reality, that's where the terror lived.
Between 1932 and 1934, as a direct result of collectivizing agriculture, a massive famine swept across the Soviet Union. It hit Ukraine so hard it has its own name, the Holodomor, which means death by hunger. Let's be clear. This was not a natural disaster. This was engineered. The state seized all the grain, sealed the borders of entire regions, and just left millions of people to starve. The death toll is estimated to be as high as 7 million.
And inside the prison camps, that raw struggle for survival was turned into a tool of control.
The whole system was designed to shred any sense of solidarity. Prisoners stole from other prisoners who were dying. Brigades of prisoners were forced to compete against each other for food. The person who was your neighbor yesterday was now your rival for a single crust of bread. It created a world where, as one survivor put it, each prisoner was living for himself, stepping on others. Stalin's own internal world, that place of constant ruthless struggle, had been perfectly copied and scaled up to imprison an entire nation.
So, we've experienced the caves, the one that made Stalin and the ones he made for others. Now, it's time to turn on the lights. We're going to use a diagnostic tool that's 2,400 years old, from the philosopher Plato, to dissect the mind that created all of this.
Plato believed our psyche has three parts, all fighting for control. Think of a healthy soul like a well-run little city. Reason, or logos, is the wise ruler. It guides your spirit, your thumos, that's your pride and ambition, and it keeps your raw desires, your appetite, or epithumia, in check. But in a tyrant, Plato says, this whole internal city gets violently overthrown. Appetite seizes power, and reason becomes its slave. And that is a perfect diagnosis of what happened inside Stalin's mind. His logos, his intellect, was brilliant, no question, but it wasn't in charge. It was completely hijacked by an insatiable appetite for absolute power and a wounded, paranoid spirit that saw every single challenge as a life-or-death threat. His brain didn't look for truth, it just looked for clever ways to justify his paranoia.
Now, what's absolutely wild is that Plato laid out a 5-point profile of the tyrannical personality. And I'm telling you, it reads less like ancient philosophy and more like a modern psychological assessment from the FBI. Let's just map Stalin onto this ancient blueprint, point by point.
First, Plato says the tyrant is driven by an all-consuming fire, an eros, that's born from some deep humiliation or deprivation early in life. Well, for Stalin, the source is obvious, right? The beatings, the poverty, the constant fear of the underground. It created this black hole inside of him that no amount of power could ever fill. His hunger for control wasn't really a political strategy. It was a psychological compulsion.
Second, the tyrant gets rid of anyone who might tell him the truth. I mean, look at the Great Purge. It wasn't random violence. It was the systematic murder of the entire generation of revolutionaries who had known him back in the day, who had argued with him, who saw him as just one of the guys. After they were gone, his inner circle was just a bunch of terrified men competing to see who could flatter him the best because they knew that was the only way to stay alive.
Third, Plato says the tyrant himself lives in constant terror. Stalin's paranoia was legendary, and it wasn't just a personality quirk. He used it as a tool to control the whole country. And get this, in 1927, a famous psychiatrist named Vladimir Bekhterev actually examined him and gave a one-word diagnosis: paranoiac. Bekhterev dropped dead the very next day, almost certainly poisoned on Stalin's orders. And finally, Plato's last points. The tyrant destroys the very thing he claims to protect, and he descends into his own private hell. Stalin claimed he was the only one who could save Lenin's revolution, and in the name of saving it, he killed more communists than all the anti-communist governments in the world put together. He left behind an industrial superpower, sure, but it was a superpower built on a foundation of terror, lies, and the bodies of some 20 million of his own citizens. Okay, so Plato gives us the why, the psychological blueprint of the tyrant. But what about the how? How did Stalin actually put it all into practice? To understand that, we need to look at the cold, rational logic behind the terror, using some more modern tools from game theory and dark psychology. First up, a concept from game theory called a commitment device. It's basically when you do something that makes it impossible for you to back down. The classic example is a general landing on an enemy shore and then ordering his own ships to be burned. It sends a very clear message to everyone: we win this thing or we die. There is no retreat. Well, the Great Purge worked exactly like that. Once Stalin launched that first wave of arrests, he trapped every single official in the country in a deadly game. Your only choices were to denounce other people or wait to be denounced yourself. There was no third option. Nobody could stop the machine, because even trying to stop it was proof that you were one of the traitors. The terror just started feeding on itself. Another key idea is the Schelling point. It's just a clear, bright line that everyone understands without having to talk about it. Think of midnight as a deadline. It's obvious. Everyone gets it. When you cross a Schelling point, a consequence happens automatically. No debate, no mercy. It's just game over. In Stalin's world, the most powerful Schelling point was the phrase, enemy of the people. It was vague, it was terrifying, and it was final. The second that label was attached to your name, your fate was sealed.
The label itself was the verdict. It was the bright line that once you crossed it, led automatically to a prison cell, the gulag, or a bullet in the back of your head.
Now for some dark psychology. There's this really disturbing thing called trauma bonding. It's where victims develop a strange, powerful loyalty to their abuser. And the bond gets formed through a cycle of intense pain followed by moments of relief or kindness. It's actually the little moments of relief that make the abuse so powerful and so confusing for the mind.
On a massive, national scale, this is what happened in the Soviet Union. The people lived through the absolute horror of the purges and the famines, but they also experienced these incredible moments of collective pride, building massive dams and factories, and of course the unbelievable, heroic victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. This cycle of horror and triumph created a deep, complicated, and very powerful bond to the very state and the very leader that was also terrorizing them.
Okay, to finish this picture, we need to go one level deeper, into the subconscious forces that were driving all this. And then we need to zoom way out to see how Stalin's methods weren't happening in a vacuum. They were part of a much bigger and darker global history.
The psychologist Carl Jung had this idea of the shadow. It's basically all the parts of ourselves that we hate and deny. Our greed, our cruelty, our fears. But the thing is, the shadow doesn't just go away. We project it onto other people. We start seeing the very traits we deny on ourselves in our enemies. That way, we get to attack our enemies while feeling completely righteous about it.
And this is exactly the dynamic of the Great Purge. The Soviet system itself was built on secrets, betrayal, and violence. But that could never be admitted. So the system's own shadow was projected outward. This huge cast of imaginary enemies was invented. Wreckers, spies, saboteurs, who were accused of all the sins the regime itself was committing. The endless hunt for these traitors was like a giant psychological ritual, meant to cleanse the system of a poison that was actually coming from within. But this is where the story gets even darker, because we have to zoom out. As horrific as Stalin's methods were, they weren't entirely original. The machinery of bureaucratic terror he perfected was, in many ways, an industrial-scale version of methods first tried out by European colonial powers in places like Africa. Forced labor for profit like the rubber trade in King Leopold's Congo, creating famines on purpose to break resistance, using concentration camps to control entire populations. Stalin might have wrapped it all in Marxist ideology, but the basic mechanics of the horror had a colonial precedent. And yet, here is the massive contradiction. At the exact same time he was using these colonial-style tactics inside his own empire, Stalin's Soviet Union was also one of the biggest supporters of anti-colonial movements around the world. It gave ideological inspiration, money, guns, and training to revolutionaries across Africa who were fighting to kick out their European rulers. So the state was, somehow, both a colonizer and a supporter of decolonization at the same time. It's a paradox you just have to hold in your head to see the whole picture.
And all of this brings us to the end of our autopsy, and to the central, brutal dilemma of Joseph Stalin's life and legacy.
It really boils down to this. He took over a weak, fragile revolution in a country that was way behind the rest of the world. He left it as one of the planet's 2 nuclear superpowers, a nation that had defeated Hitler and industrialized faster than any country in history. And he did it all with a system of terror that murdered roughly 20 million of its own people. Both of those sentences are true.
After being inside the mind of Joseph Stalin, do you think he was a paranoid monster who destroyed the revolution, or simply the only man who understood that the revolution would destroy him first?